IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talk. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. This year marks the 100th birth anniversary of Satyajit Ray, the internationally recognized filmmaker. With a canon of great films in his repertoire, this anniversary would have been marked with great fanfare, but it was affected because of the pandemic and the elections in West Bengal. Nonetheless, Ray remains in the hearts of his legions of fans all over the world. And for those who have worked with him, the memories are even more special. Dhritiman Chatterjee, who made his film acting debut in Ray's Pratidwandi, is one of them. Pratidwandi was a landmark film, one of the very few Ray made on politics of the day. When Bengal was in the throes of violence, there are sharp touches of political commentary in the film which captures the spirit and zeitgeist of the time. Chatterjee speaks about his memories of Ray, his style of working, and his own illustrious career as an actor since then. We'll be back after this short break to continue our chat with Dhritiman Chatterjee.
Have you heard of the Cred Rewards Festival going on this IPL season? From the 27th of April to the 3rd of May, you stand a chance to win crazy jackpots every day and offers from partners on specific days. This is the Cred Rewards Festival, so download Cred now.
Dhritiman Chatterjee, welcome to the Wire Talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's the birth anniversary of Satyajit Ray and a bit more than 50 years since Pratidwandi. But before we come to both, it is a pity that the centenary is not being celebrated with more fanfare. And I think a lot of people are sort of disappointed, wouldn't you say?
Yes and no. Let me try and explain that. I mean, people who are film enthusiasts and know and love the work of Ray obviously are disappointed. For example, we have a Society for the Preservation of Ray's works and archiving them in Kolkata. We had planned a lot of activities this year, which we will unfortunately not be able to pursue. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, they have a fairly extensive program. And I think they are planning, from what I know, they are planning to go ahead with it. As far as the general public, I know it's a very broad term, but the general public, frankly, this might come as unexpected to many. But I wonder, especially today with all, with the pandemic, the elections, and the general turbulence all around, I wonder among the general public how much of an enthusiasm there is about the centenary and the celebration. So it's a sort of a mixed bag.
One of the significant things about Ray is that he has gone far beyond a regional filmmaker and is now a national and international figure, widely recognized by his peers and his younger filmmakers since then. And that's not just because of the mastery he had over his craft, but also because his films are about the human condition. There is a universality about his works, and that has touched us throughout the last so many years, ever since he made his first film. Did you see that in him constantly as a filmmaker, as seeing it on the screen?
Yes. The overall answer to that, of course, is yes. He dealt with, let us say, stories about the human condition. Define that as you will. Let me share an anecdote with you. I had, apart from the two or three films that I worked in with him, I used to visit him very often, as indeed did a lot of people, and we had long conversations on various things, not just cinema, but literature, anthropology, politics of the day, and so on. And in the course of a very long interview, in fact, I think it was his last published interview, which I did with him just before he got the Lifetime Achievement Oscar. One of the questions that I had asked him was that, in classical music, in Hindustani and Carnatic classical music, there is the concept of the rasika. The Rasika being an informed listener, one who knows the grammar of music and is able to assess music, not just for its musical quality, but in how it adheres to the grammar or how and why it departs from the grammar. So I asked him, do you think the concept of the Rasika applies to your cinema as well? His response was this. He said, look, among other things, Rai was a very, very practical sort of person. Maybe we'll come back to that later. So what he told me was this, that one is that I know I'm always conscious of the fact that I have an obligation to my producer to try and bring back the money that he invested in the film. And that also for a very, very practical reason, which is that if I don't bring back that money, then chances are I shan't have the opportunity to make my next film. So therefore, he said, my primary audience, I am always conscious of the fact that my primary audience is the educated, somewhat urbanized Bengali middle class. My films have to attract them. My stories have meaning for them. But a Rasika would be a person who will dig deeper. So that opportunity I try and leave open in my films. I try and build my films in layers so that if someone wishes, he can dig deeper and find significances, relationships, and so on. So that is how he made his films. By being somewhat complex, never being, now, there may be people who support that point of view, there may be people who oppose that point of view, but as we know, he was never directly political. He said whatever he wanted to say in a sort of indirect kind of way.
Actually, that segues into my next question quite well. So that was one of the criticisms that many of his younger admirers and the generation that grew up a little later in the 70s used to make, that he was never radical in his filmmaking. I would think that pertains to his style and content, because if you remember, there were a lot of films being made at that time, which I can quite honestly call only self-indulgent. They didn't have Ray's understanding of the obligations the director towards his producer at the end of the day. But is that a fair critique? Because, he did make several points with what he made and the films he made. So is that really a fair point, a fair critique of his work?
The fact that he was never directly political, you mean?
Yes, as he himself acknowledges.
Yeah, well, Siddharth, that is, we can spend hours talking about that because it depends on a lot of things. It depends on temperament. It depends on tradition a person has imbibed. We have to remember that Rai belonged to or grew up from Renaissance generation in Bengal, the liberal, open-minded Renaissance generation. And indeed, we can call him a part of that Renaissance generation. So what in Bangla is called the Bhadralok, the genteel man, as different from the gentleman, he was very much the Bhadralok. And the Bengali Bhadralok, if you look at Rai, if you look at, others in that segment, I mean, after him, before him, if you look at people like Amartya Sen, for example, none of them in their various fields have been strident. All of them believe in speaking in a gentle sort of tone of voice, making the points that they wish to make, making those points somewhat indirectly, softly. So he was part of that milieu. Coming to the film I worked with, my first film, Pratidwandi, known in English as The Adversary. Before Pratidwandi, which was 1968, 1969, there was a sort of soft deeply spoken, unspoken criticism among a section of film lovers and critics that Rai was avoiding the political problems of the day. As you know, those were very turbulent times, especially in Bengal. That was the time of the ultra-left movement. And other people, for example, Mrinal Sen, which, opens a whole other box, which we can talk about if we wish and have the time for. Mrinal Sen was addressing those much more directly. But that, again, as I said, depends on temperament and on background. But there was this criticism that Rai was not grappling with the problems of the day. And Pratidwandi, in many ways, was a response to that criticism, not only in subject matter, but also in technique. Rai, as we know, had a very seamless, smooth, narrative kind of style. In Pratidwandi, he departed from that. Things like the handheld camera, freezes, techniques like this, which we were used to seeing from some filmmakers, from Ronaldo, for example, but which he had abjured till then. We saw these appearing for the first time in his cinema in Pratidwandi. So in that sense, Pratidwandi was a new phase in his filmmaking. And of course, then it went on to become his Calcutta trilogy with two other films, which also were very contemporary and spoke about the here and now.
In fact, I would say, looking back, and even then, one would have seen that film and the trilogy in general as a response to his critics to show that, when it comes to this, I'm no slouch either. So, this is my kind of response. How did you get chosen for it?
I was hoping, Siddharth, that you wouldn't ask that, because I've lost count of the number of times I've had to respond, almost, especially this being the time it is, almost on a daily basis. But for the sake of your listeners, let me quickly go through that. In a sense, we go back a long way, in the sense that when I was I've been part of what are called film buffs for a long time, ever since school, college, etc. It was when I was in college in Kolkata, then that one discovered the French New Wave, for example. And then university in Delhi. When I was in university in Delhi, a bunch of us said, okay, let's start a film society, which we did. And in those days, film society, of course, you had to depend on either the Film Federation or on some of the more helpful embassies in Delhi to get your films for screening. So the Film Society started mainly for people in the university circle, and it was running fairly well. So we said, let's try. We got a little more ambitious and said, let's try and start a magazine. Of course, days before the internet and mobile phones and so on. So we waited for hours near the public telephone booth in the Jubilee Hall hostel, trying to get in touch with people like Rai, Shyam Benegal, Mrinal Sen, a wonderful filmmaker called Shanti Chaudhary at that time, and so on. During holiday at that time, I took myself to Rai's doorstep. And those were days when there weren't the firewalls of secretaries and fixing prior appointments and so forth. If he was at home, he would generally open the door to you, whether you were known to him or even if you were a stranger. So he said, good, great, but I'm going off to the Montreal Film Festival in the next couple of days. So come back to me, leave a set of questions, then come back to me when I'm back and we'll talk about it. In the event, of course, the magazine never came out, but that was our first meeting. Then when he was planning Pratidwandi, I had finished university, I was back in Kolkata, I was working, just started working. Then a common friend said that, look, Rai is looking for a new person for this film. Why don't you go and see him? So I said, okay, why not? So off I went. Both of us recollected our previous meeting. And that is how it happened. I would like to say here, though, at that time, I had no dreams, no ambitions, no wish to become, a film star. I was interested in cinema, and my enthusiasm or my wish to be in Rai's film really had to do with seeing how he worked rather than launching myself as an actor. That was really not the intention at all. And in this thing of watching the man work, I was very successful because during the shoot, I hung around whether I had a shot in that on that particular day or in that particular shift or not. So that's the very long answer to your very brief question.
Okay, well, I think our listeners would be most satisfied because even though you have possibly got extremely tired and bored of answering it, it's new to us. It's certainly new to me. But what did you discover? I mean, as an actor, not as an observer, did he have a, we always, we have always read that he had a very clear idea of his film from the way it would look to and unfold to even the music and the poster. Did you surrender yourself to him? Was there any room for discussion, argument? Were you just mesmerized? What do you recall?
Okay, that's a very complex question with various strands to it. So allow me to be a little long-winded. To start with, one of the reasons for my admiration, and more than admiration, my curiosity about Rai, even before I met him, was the fact that he was I hesitate to use the word genius because it's an overused word, but was his multifaceted ability. And that also I like to think that is a Renaissance trait. He was, as far as cinema was concerned, he was the screenplay writer, he was the director, he supervised the editing. After a certain point, he did the cinematography himself, he did the music, apart from which he was an accomplished writer. He was an illustrator. As you probably know, he even has a typeface to his name. So I had always been curious about how one man could have so many qualities. And I often, to myself and with friends, I often play this what if game, which is to say that, if he had not been a filmmaker, or if his first film hadn't become such a critical success, what would he have done? And the answer is, of course, that the whole wide world was open to him. He could have done, or he could have been various things. He could have been a writer, he could have been a musician, he could have been an advertising person. So there was that on the one hand. Coming to specifically to the question you asked about how he directed actors, as you yourself said, he constructed his scripts down to the last detail, storyboarded them, drew the sets, everything. Part of that was because he was capable of doing that, and part of it was because of very practical reasons, which is that, even at the height of his fame, he was never allowed a huge budget. He used to have to make films on very limited sums of money. So he had to be economical. He did not have the luxury which a lot of films have these days of shooting endlessly. He had to finish in a limited number of days. So he had to pre-plan as meticulously as possible. So what he would do is that when his script was absolutely complete, he would call everybody together, that is to say his unit, the cinematographer, everybody, the actors, and do a reading. And that reading always used to be a very animated kind of reading, so that more or less you got a fair idea. If you were involved with the film, you got a fair idea of what he intended to do. So that was it. And then see you on the sets. So therefore, there was no, things that you have these days of acting workshops, etc. He didn't do any of those things. He didn't go into analysis, or I sometimes call it an over-analysis of the character and dissecting it and so forth. You just went by instinct. So there you are on the set, and as an actor, if you had questions, you were free to ask. On the set, though, he had, the way I observed it, he had two ways of dealing with actors. One lot, he would leave relatively free to do things the way they wished to do it, including modifying little bits in the dialogue if they wish to. And I was fortunate enough to belong to that group. Other actors, including some who've done memorable roles in his films, I shan't mention them here. Other actors, he would direct in a much more, in almost in a mechanical kind of way. While the shot was on, he would say, all right, now stop, wait, take a step forward, look to your left, now say the line. So he used two complete techniques which were on virtually opposite sides of the scale. So that's one thing I remember. The other thing which I think would be interesting to your listeners is that it is said that he was so good with first-time actors and non-actors. I mean, that he had the ability to bring them to life. And I later realized I've not talked to him about it. The occasion never arose. But, when I first went to see him with a view to working in this film, we chatted for virtually a couple of hours. And we chatted not only about cinema, or not mainly about cinema, but about family, sports, politics, education, a lot of things. And I later realized that he could do this with first-time actors or actors that he did not know in order to very keenly observe them, their what we call now their body language, their manner of speaking, what was the cadence in the way they spoke and so on. And then he would incorporate these traits when he gave final shape to a character, and particularly the dialogue of that character. So that in first-timers, all of this came very naturally, very spontaneously. They were very comfortable with what that particular actor was doing. To extend that a little further, maybe in another direction, I've never, as we know, film sets are often tense places, tense for various reasons. Sometimes a great deal of screaming and shouting goes on. We actors, we've often had to face these situations. But Rai's set was always, even when the physical conditions were demanding, Rai's sets were always very relaxed places. You could relax, think about things, and do things the way you want to do them. So that is my very long answer to your very brief question.
So, in fact, it's a very enlightening answer because it shows the kind of faith he had in his selection, in the ability of a first-time actor to be let them be themselves. So, I think it does tell us a lot about the man and his mastery over not just his filmmaking, but also in appreciating people and their personalities. So, for me, as a young man growing up in the 70s, I can tell you that the film came as a jolt. It just shook us. I didn't live in Calcutta. I lived in Bombay at the time, and it just shook us. And I went to see it twice in a week. His films used to show at obscure cinemas and things like that. But I went twice, I saw it, I said, this is talking to me. And I remember specific scenes. And of course, the interview scene has become iconic, but also his encounters with Kia, his girlfriend, his conflicts at home. Um, it talked to us. Did it talk to you in the same way? I mean, you were a child growing up, you were older, but you were around in the 70s. You saw what was happening in your city.
Yes. Well, this is sort of an extension of the answer to your previous question. You know, when this film was made, at the time that it was made, I was, for all intents and purposes, I was Siddhartha. In real life, maybe I was just a bit older than Siddhartha. I was not unemployed. I had a job. But I came from the same background. I was a average middle class Bengali boy, same background as Siddhartha, aware of the political situation, with many friends, as was the case with most people or most young people, those left leaning, involved in politics, and college friends. I had college friends who had become directly involved and had become part of the ultra-left movement. So Siddhartha, in that sense, was not alien, was not a character I did not know. It was somebody I felt I knew very well. And you were saying, Siddharth, that how much it moved you when you first saw it. The wonderful thing is that even now, 50 years later, when one is at film seminars and so on, young people come up to me even now and say how relevant they find the film and Siddhartha to their own conditions. The practical conditions may have changed, but what shall I say, the confusion, the lack of direction, the unease with the social and political situation, the anxiety about how to deal with it, all of that remains very much the same. Now, the dealing with it, the solution to it, the individual answer, that will be different in different cases. In the Kolkata trilogy that Ronaldo made at that time, for example, I was a part of one of the films. Rinalda's approach was a much more direct solution, whereas Rai kept the indecision, the lack of finality, the lack of answers. He kept that atmosphere going.
So, young people watching it today do get touched by it and, link it with their angst. But does the film per se work? Has it traveled well?
I think so. Even as a film, that is to say, technically, stylistically, in my view, it has aged well, which brings us to another question, which is that to an entirely different sort of question, which is that, we are a nation, particularly us Bangalis, we are given to hero worship, as you know. And one of the things that's happening in the centenary year is that quite literally statues are being put up and the man is being idolized, much like Tagore. As it happens, Tagore's birthday is not very far away. When that happens, critical reevaluation goes out of the window. And I'm sorry to say that certainly, to the best of my knowledge, India, certainly in Bengal, there has not been a great deal of critical reevaluation of Rai's work. People are always afraid that there are certain, what is the word? I forget the word, but there are certain, sacred icons that you must never touch, that you must never question.
More's the shame, because I think knowing what he was and having read him, he would have welcomed it, I think. But moving on.
Well, no, let me finish this, Siddharth. He was, as I said, when we talked, he used to be very enthusiastic about younger filmmakers and the work that they were doing. I remember at that time, one of the filmmakers that he used to mention again and again in our conversation was Ketan Mehta, for example. Ketan at that time was, of course, a junior filmmaker. Ketan, and especially Mirch Masala, his film. So he was very generous with his compliments and his appreciation. But I wish there was more, this occasion of his centenary was taken as an opportunity to critically reevaluate his works. To me personally, I mean, all this starts with the question you asked about, whether a certain film has traveled well. To my mind, Pratidwandi has traveled well, but I cannot say, quite frankly, the same of all his films. I know that's probably a separate discussion, but I can talk about films which, to me, for one reason or another, form, content, various reasons, have not traveled well, have not aged well.
Yeah. On a related note, let me tell you that we were looking around for pieces that did exactly that. And very few people were ready to touch this kind of hot potato, if I may call it. So by the time you made the third film with him, Agantuk, he was almost 70. It turned out to be his last film. Did you see any difference in him too?
No, he made one film. I forget the chronology, but most probably Shaka Proshaka came after that. I'm just trying to think whether Shaka Proshaka came after that or preceded it. Anyway, that can be looked up.
But you worked with him towards one of his final films, and he was almost 70. Did you see any difference in him decades after your first time you worked with him?
Well, no, as I said, I was a constant visitor and we used to chat and so forth. But of course, I never expressed it to him. But of course, I wished, which actor wouldn't, that I wish give me another film. Anyway, that happened with Ganesha from Ibsen's Enemy of the People, which he did right after an extended illness. And of course, his way of working had changed a great deal. When we were doing Ganesha, there was an ambulance standing outside set all the time. His cardiologist used to drop in very often and so on. And it shows in the film. He chose to make a film which he could do without having to travel, without having to exert physically. So it was almost a theater format taken from a stage play. Of course, he was dying to get back to work. That was one thing. The other thing, which is equally important, is that is the time when this ugly thing, whole religious fundamentalism thing, which we see now, was starting to kind of raise its ugly head. And there was this whole business in Calcutta and Bengal of Ganesh idols, I think it is, drinking milk. And, housewives queuing up at temples and all of this nonsense was going on. I don't know, I'd probably get trolled for calling it nonsense, but be that as it may. Now, this troubled him a great deal. And he felt that he had to say something about it. And Ganesha was that statement. Now, Ganesha, he gave me what used to be called a villain, but more politely, these days, we call it a negative character. So he gave me a negative character to play, and it was the first time really I was playing a negative character because I had this stamp of the angry young man sort of character. So, but, mustered up enough resolution to go and ask him, Manika, as you know, he was the universal Manika to everyone. Manika, thik hoche to? Meaning, you think it's all going okay? His answer to that was he said, if everything is not all right, I'll let you know. That's all.
So actually, you touched upon something I was coming to right now. How would Satyajit Ray have responded to what's happening today in India and his beloved Bengal? As a human being, as a creative person, as a filmmaker, he had an idea of the ethos of his people and his other Bengalis. How would he have responded?
Yeah, that is also, we've often talked about it later on. As you know, Sadgati, his film for Doordarshan, Sadgati was a fairly, from Munshi Premchand's story, Sadgati was a fairly pungent, I would say, critique about the caste system. But the whole media environment has changed a great deal. What I mean by that, and I keep saying this, is that where, in the 1960s and 70s, at the time of Pratidwandi, for example, cinema was almost the only mass medium. Statements other than the printed medium, statements that you had to make, uh, uh, including political statements, cinema was almost your only medium, which is, for example, why we see so much political cinema at that time in Cuba, Latin America, places like that. It's interesting, for example, to think about the fact that Memories of Underdevelopment, alias film on communism in Cuba, which is a directly political film, is virtually a contemporary of Protidon. Memories of Underdevelopment was made in 1968. But the tones of the films are so very different. But things have changed now in the sense that cinema is no longer the only, indeed, perhaps not even the main medium of mass communication. There are so many, television, of course, but OTT channels, blogs, podcasts, you name it. There are so many ways to express yourself. So what Rai would have done, I've talked about this, we've had this discussion elsewhere, of how he would have responded, for example, just to the technical issue of transiting from analog to digital. How would he have responded to that? How would he have responded to the OTT platform? So this question is also part of that. How would he have responded? He would have responded. Of that, there is no doubt. My feeling is, and it's just a feeling, you could say that it's also a wish, that he would have taken advantage of the wider media choices available now to do a series with a political content, not just a film, but he would have taken the opportunity to do a series. Because after all, there is really, everybody who's working on the OTT medium or everybody who's making a film, really speaking, is making an international film. Boundaries of regional cinema, national cinema, those boundaries have, except in cases where it is very, very, very culture specific, those boundaries have almost disappeared. So he would have responded in some way or the other.
Your own career has flowered, but you've worked in very few films. So either it's out of being choosy, or otherwise you find each film something you want to work out in some details. You're not one of those who's churning out 3 a year, but you've worked with a wide variety of directors, from Mrinal Sen to Aparna Sen to Sanjay Leela Bansali, even Sri Ram Raghavan and Jane Campion, Deepa Mehta. That's quite a diverse range. What did you see? Uh, you know, what are the differences you've seen in general terms in the system of filmmaking, and in the approach, let's say, Bengali filmmakers have vis-a-vis Hindi filmmakers, and even internationally?
Okay. Again, a complex question. First of all, thank you for being so generous in saying that my career has flowered. Quite frankly, between you and me, of course, it won't stay between you and me, but I do wish sometimes that I had more interesting work. Okay, very quickly, as I said right in the beginning, film acting was never my primary career. I worked with Manika, then Rinalda, really more out of interest in seeing what they were doing. I had a successful career and a career that I enjoyed in advertising, in making lots of important films, non-fiction films, but documentary and educational films and so on. So I wanted the liberty of being able to pick and choose my acting assignments. A lot of my contemporaries who gave up other careers to become full-time actors have lamented later on the fact that they lost their autonomy. But I wanted to have my autonomy. even if that meant not becoming, a well-known star. And I never did become a well-known star. So again, later on in my career, when I decided to go sort of within brackets mainstream with Sanjay and Sriram, it was again really the curiosity to see, the inquisitiveness, to be a part of that environment and see how that environment functioned. Of course, I admired Jane Campion's films, the ones that I had seen, starting with The Piano. So I grabbed at the opportunity to work with her. And it meant that I had one scene with Kate Winslet. And I got to touch, I was playing a sadhu, and I had to bless her. So I had to touch her on the forehead with my forefinger. It was not, I assure you, during Shahi Snan in COVID times. But that apart, I had to touch her on the forehead. And between you and me, I did not wash my forefinger, having made contact with Kate Winslet's forehead for the next 3 days or something. Anyway, more seriously, yes, I mean, the way my experience of big-time Bombay cinema, the latest has been a film called Chehre. And there were others, such as Pink and so on. It's all been very enjoyable, but it's all very different from the way that a much more modest industry like the Bangla film industry works. But it's always interesting. I mean, I find it very interesting to kind of get a peep into all these little worlds. And, people, once upon a time, people used to ask me that, we know that you have a limited number of films. How do you go about choosing? And I had these very lofty answers, like I look for the credentials of the director, I look for the social component and so on, all of which was partly true. But then I realized much later that it really boiled down to something quite simple, which is very simply, given with the experience that I have accumulated, it is a project with everything that entails the script, the director, the co-actors, the producer, everything combined, simple question. Will I look forward to going to work the following morning? Or will I say to myself, oh, I wish the shooting is cancelled. Oh, I wish it rains today, things like that. It boils down to something as simple and as intuitive as that. Will I enjoy working? Again, a long answer to a very brief and succinct question.
So clearly you have enjoyed with many of these blockbusters. I mean, it was quite a pleasant surprise. I'm a great fan of Sriram's work. And I was one of the few.
So am I, actually.
I was one of the few who defended Agent Vinod till the cows came home. And it's a pleasant surprise to see that you were playing this global tycoon. Are you busy as ever or taking it easy now? What's coming up?
Well, that's the thing, Siddharth. I've never been, within quotes, as busy as ever. As I told you, sometimes I wish I had more interesting work coming my way. But in answer to your question, another film called Chehre, also with Amitabh, whereby hangs a little tale. I mean, for some reason, starting with Black, Amitabh and I have worked at almost exactly 5-year intervals, So when we met on the sets of Chehre, actually when we met on the sets of Pink, we were saying to each other, okay, now what happens? Are we next going to be in a film together 5 years from now? And will the film be called Red or Green or White or something like that? See, that did not happen. We met on the sets of a film called Chehre, which is sort of within 4 walls, not literally, but to a large extent, which has some very fine actors. But again, it's got, in very many ways, stuck and mired in these COVID times. So there are interesting films that I'm hoping to be part of. We keep talking about them, both in Kolkata as well as in Bombay. But, the times being what they are, when they will get started is anybody's guess.
Yes, I think all of us are waiting with bated breath to get back to some level of normalcy. But no. One absolutely last question, because it's another question that you must have asked about 2,500 times. Let's make it once more. What's your absolute favorite Ray film?
What's my absolute favorite Ray film? Very difficult question, but it may change from time to time. I mean, I'd probably toss, but it would be between Charulata and Arunyatin Ratri. It's a sort of a toss-up.
You've gone with the classics.
I don't know. Well, I suppose Charulata
You've gone with the classic.
Call a classic because it's taken from a classic property, but I'm not so sure that you'd call Arunyatin Ratri a classic. After all, it's from a contemporary novel. But what I like about Arunyatin Ratri really is its construction, and it's almost formal sort of structure. You see, that needs a bit of an explanation. There used to be a time when the Bengali serialized novel was very popular. And Sunil Gangopadhyay, the author of Arunyatin Ratri, wrote it for a very popular Bangla literary journal as in a serialized form. And in a serialized form, obviously what tends to happen is that the number of characters, the situations, they tend to get pulled and strung out and so on. So when you're making a film, it's always a struggle of how to kind of get all this material into control. And I think Rai did that wonderfully well in giving it a formal kind of structure, a structure that he had in mind, which had nothing to do with, really, in a sense, with the structure of the novel. That's what I admire about it.
So for whatever it's worth, I mean, I speak as a fan who does not know the language and has viewed all his films, seen all of them over and over again, some of them. But for whatever it's worth, my favorite remains Mahanagar. And I would like your quick opinion on it.
Mahanagar, I think, strangely, it's wonderful that you mention it, because strangely, when his contemporary films, when his urban films are mentioned and talked about, the trilogy, of course, is talked about, but Mahanagar somehow slips through the gaps in these discussions. Somehow it is underrated. But I think Mahanagar is a very important film, not only structurally and cinematically, but in its observation of middle-class Bengali life, and very importantly, in what it says ever so indirectly about the woman in middle-class society.
And that is true, and it exposes middle-class hypocrisies like nothing I've seen. So on that very note, Dhritiman, thank you very much. I know you said that you had several requests for interviews, but thank you that we managed to get an opportunity to talk to you. It will revive memories of that wonderful time and the great filmmaker. So I hope a new generation goes out and rediscovers him and says, okay, these films still make a lot of sense to me, and it's important that I know about them. So thank you once again for joining us at the Wire Talk.
Thank you very much, Siddharth, and everybody else at the Wire for having me. Thank you very much.
So that was the great Dhritiman Chatterjee, Siddhartha to most of us in Pratidwandi. And we'll be back again with another interview next week on The Wire Talk. Goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Ciet, thewholetruthfoods.com, and PayPal. We really appreciate your support. So this week on Cyrus Says, Cyrus had some interesting guests. Kayos Irani was on to talk about his new Netflix film, and Mayur Tekchandani has made a new coffee table book about the city of Mumbai, which he came to discuss on the show. On the Wire Talk, Siddharth Bhatia was joined by Dr. Ali Khan Mahmoodabad to talk about the Muslim community's issues during these thorny times. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor is joined by Sonia Jas to talk about the importance of fitness and why this is a great time to begin a journey to good health. The Simplified Gang has reunited and they discuss the hue and cry around the European Super League that was eventually just dropped after 2 days. On Shunya One, Shilith and I are talking to Gurubat from PayPal India. We talk about fintech, the future of digital payments, and a whole lot more. Really deep and interesting conversation about PayPal, its plans in India, and what kind of hiring they're looking to do. On The Millennial Athlete, Tanvi and Shlok were joined by sport and performance psychologist Dr. Shri Advani to talk about mental health for young sports stars. And I just want to again mention some of our cricket shows. The IPL season is on, and you should definitely check out Edges and Sledges. And we also have a Hindi show called Khel Niti. Do check that out as well. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with postcards from nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IBM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.